kind of the expectation with anything today is that it's going to be plug and play, and within audio, especially, that's not always how audio is. It's not always plug and play. You have to do some troubleshooting,
especially on Windows.
Yeah, especially on Windows, and getting your audio interface to work on Windows. But part of it comes down to how familiar somebody is with computers, how kind of like tech savvy and computer literate they are. Like there's certain people that I wouldn't even. It's like, oh, you want to get into recording? Well, let's get you this handheld recorder.
Here's a Zoom.
That'll be the best thing for you.
There's a technical prerequisite aspect. You have to be a little bit tech savvy. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah. If you can get a printer to work with your computer, you can probably get an audio interface to work with your computer.
You're listening to the GWNL-Podcast. Guys with no lives talking about audio.
Hello and welcome to GWNL-Podcast, episode 19. It's a war in here because it's Mac versus Windows, and I am the only Windows person in this entire podcast. So it's going to be both of them trying to like talk me out of using a Windows computer and like fighting me about it because I'm different than everybody else. I'm just built different this way. We've already gotten to it.
We're not going to try to convince him not to use a Windows computer. We're just trying to convince him not to speak so ill of Mac. That's all.
When Mac deletes my audio control surface software for my desks at work without asking me, where my iPad just deletes things that I didn't ask for. Yeah, that's so much better. I'm so glad that I have Big Brother to tell me. Sorry. Okay.
I've never had that issue before, Joe. Sounds like a user error.
Yeah.
Really? On an iPad, there's user error? I thought it was designed so you couldn't mess it up.
Not at all. It's designed so Brian can't mess it up.
Oh, my bad.
So Joe can.
Okay, so I want to, before we get into it, because we're already getting into it.
Yeah, let's get into the real stuff.
I want to say one thing. Everyone always is like, oh, you hate Mac. I hate Mac for me. I have definitely directed people. And for the record, Mac is great for people who don't want to learn how computers run or are not familiar with computers and that kind of technology super well. It's a lot more user-friendly. It's a lot more easier. And I know I make a big deal about it, and like, because I hate it, because again, my struggle is with somebody else telling me how to use my computer. That's my big issue. It's my computer. I don't like somebody telling me how to do it. For me, for other people, I get it. Macs are great. Okay, with that being said.
Well, this is a good point, because this actually goes over, and we need to do one about different Daws, but it actually goes into Daws as well, and the customization of the Daws. So just like you can customize your Windows computer more than you can your Mac, because it's like Windows is like, let's set it up so that you can customize it, and Mac is like, well, you can customize a little bit, but we're going to set up most of it so it runs really smoothly for you, and you don't have any customization. A lot of Daws have that same kind of issue where they're
like a difference of opinion, I would say.
Yeah, and that's why it's okay to use different Daws than other people. And that's why it's okay to use Mac or Windows. It's not like one is superior to the other. That's the first point that we need to make, right?
Yeah. One's not better
One
than
is superior to the other.
They're
I'm just kidding.
You can have that opinion, but you're still wrong.
As long as you're not using Linux, you're fine. In audio.
I honestly...
In audio.
There are people that do, though. Like, anyways, that's a side note. That's a whole different world.
I wish there were more audio things for Linux. That'd be cool.
I totally agree.
But it's true.
I think Linux is the future.
Yeah, that's what we all thought 20 years ago, too.
Now everyone's Android phone, oh, wait, everyone uses iPhones. Okay.
Yeah,
all right, so let's start about some key differences.
So the first thing is that is one better than other? The answer is emphatically no. Okay. No. There's different reasons why various people are going to be more comfortable using one than the other, or if depending on the software or the hardware that you're using, where one will work better or worse than other. But in general, there's professional recording studios, there's tons of home studios that use either one. There's nothing that says one is professional or superior to the other.
I just want to say this. Pro Tools Expert uses Windows now.
Yeah.
Anyways, I'm kidding. I'm sorry. Okay. Let's talk about the core difference. Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of the like key differences in relation to audio is Mac will come stock with a really, really powerful like audio driver called Core Audio. And that's really, really powerful. That basically for anybody that is doing home recording, maybe you're going to get like a Focusrite 2i2 or something like that. You're basically going to have a plug and play audio interface. Whereas on Windows, you do have to download ASIO or ACO for all, however you pronounce that. I've heard it both ways. And then you also have to make sure you download the drivers for whatever audio interface you have. Like, it took a little bit of work to get my Mackie Onyx to work on a Windows computer. It took a little bit to get like the Scarlett 2i2 to work on a computer. But after I got those things installed, got them working, I was like, okay, here's my process. I have my process down. I can like get this to work now pretty easily. And
I've had, I had a student who, with his ACO for all, it was finicky. Like it's like I had this working at home. He brought his Surface in to the lesson, and it didn't want to work there. So, and that was just using his headphone jack on the computer, and so he had to like uninstall ACO for all. And yeah, anyways, it's problematic.
Okay, so let me come into the Windows side, because they've been dicking on Windows now. So
it's just the core audio is built into it and works great, and ACO for all can work fine, but it is a separate thing you've got to do.
So again, I want to come back to the same point. If you're very familiar with computers and you are reasonably technically savvy with computer systems, I have never had any issues with ASIO for all in the last like 15 years that I've been playing around with audio. I'm serious. Like, if there have been issues, they have been mitigated for me really fast. And I know I'm the technical wizard, whatever.
I thought you said that you had no issues. You just barely said if you had issues.
I mean, if everyone has issues at some point, like, yeah. See, this is the thing. You guys are gonna be no. But here's the thing, though. Like, yeah, okay. So you have to download drivers, but the reality is, like, if you've been on Windows for any length of time and you're reasonably comfortable with Windows, you'll know that. Like, it's not like a freaking like new thing that you have to download drivers for your printer or whatever you're going to be using. And yeah, I get it. Mac is a lot more plug and play. I understand that. I'm not arguing that Windows doesn't take configuring. But at this point, you're kind of used to it if you've been using computers as long as I have. If you're a musician who's never really played with computers, go Mac. I'm never going to say not to. Like, that's not what I'm getting at. But like, good, bad, otherwise, again, a lot of those things come down to how comfortable and how much you know about your computer system. Again, if you don't feel comfortable with that,
how computer savvy you are. I think that's a good point. Is your computer savviness, and that's really what you're saying, Joe.
Yeah,
is that, I mean, and the tough thing is you are really computer savvy, and so it's hard to compare yourself to the average user. And I got a fly like hit me in the face. Your average user is, if one fly gets into the studio, then it just,
but so like with those things, when you're considering Windows versus Mac, if you like, because I ran into this is why I'm bringing this up, because everyone uses Mac. I almost bought a Mac and I probably would have been really pissed off, and I know that because I have Mac products and they piss me off because of the things that they do, the decisions that they make that I don't like, and the decisions that they choose to affect with me.
I will say that all the other things, all the non-computer Mac products are like so plug and play that they do cause more problems. Like the computers are the least. I mean, all the handheld devices, they try to make them so plug and play that it's true. They can be frustrating like that. But
likewise. Anyways, so let's talk about OS features. Bryant, take it away. Like the differences in OSs.
Honestly, the biggest one that sticks out to me is not even like that big of a deal. It's just like the look. I really think that the way that Mac is set up is really classy. Windows just feels
business. I know.
Old. I don't know. It just feels outdated a little bit to me.
That's the crazy thing. I mean, first of all, the history behind this is, you had these two companies creating like operating systems. You had
no stealing operating systems from Xerox, both of them. There's no nice guys in this conversation.
But they had like different mentalities, and like Apple had the desktop concept that everything's like on your desktop and moving around, and Windows is called Windows because everything is about opening up a window for something. And then of course they borrowed things from each other, so you have a desktop on each and you have Windows on each. But it was interesting, like just recently I actually got back on a PC on a Windows computer to help somebody out on their studio, and I was really surprised at how little had changed over the last, since like over the last 15 years since I've really used Windows. I mean, and Mac has changed a ton, and the Windows interface, and just the way to navigate, it just felt really clunky and old because it hadn't. And I'm like, oh, how do I remember using this 20 years ago? Oh yeah, it still works in the same way. See, there we go. We're knocking on.
Can I just say that really quickly? It hasn't changed in 20 years, which means if you know how it works, it's going to work the same way 20 years later. So you can sit there and dog on it, but the reality is it works, and I'm used to that. Exactly. I get Mac. I've troubleshot Macs. Heck, I've boot hacked half the school Macs. Don't tell anybody at school. But all of those things I can do.
If you're comfortable with it,
just use it. And this is the thing. I think this is the bigger thing about Windows versus Mac, because I was one of those people who's very familiar and very power user, Windows user. And I was like, oh, should I get a Mac or should I get Windows? Because everyone's like, oh, get a Mac because it's like, again, all of these reasons. But the thing is, I'm still really good with Windows, and I don't have nearly as many problems as a lot of other people do because I'm really good with Windows.
Yeah.
So if you're on the edge and you understand Windows, you don't have to go to Mac. And I think that's like the biggest thing I want to get at. Because like for me, I would have to learn a whole new interface, a whole new logic for how everything works. And I've done that. I've had to kind of play that game because half the school, like growing up, we used Macs in school and I used Windows at home. And so like I was always that kid that knew what was going on in the computer. So like the teacher didn't know how to fix it. So she'd be like, oh, Joe, come fix this. And I'd go fix the thing for them.
Protection from hackers and from viruses. That's what I'm
you're talking about that. Yeah. So
that's part of the OS. That's a huge part. That is really big. Because Macs are way less susceptible to viruses than PCs, than Windows.
No, they're not.
Yes, they are.
No, they're not. I've had this conversation with people many, many times. It's not that Mac isn't more or less susceptible. I understand that it's a Unix-based system, and in theory, it is less susceptible to viruses. But I do remember very distinctly every fripping computer in our computer lab at one point having viruses. Like, you open a web browser, and suddenly your whole frickin' screen is covered. It was such a problem at school on the Mac. So first and foremost, yes, Macs do get viruses.
Well, I'll tell you this. It's simple math, Joe. This is the point that I make about this. If you are a hacker that's trying to create, viruses, why would you spend all this time trying to make a virus that's going to work on Mac computers and attack 2% of the population, as opposed to do it on a Windows computer and attack 98% of the population?
And I'll counter that by saying I haven't gotten a virus or any kind of malware on my computer for over a decade of using Windows computers.
Well, I'll tell you this. The casual user, okay? I can go to anybody on my street that uses a Windows computer, and the amount of viruses that they have and the amount of antivirus software that they have compared to my kid who has a Mac computer is an astronomical difference. So you're not the normal computer user.
Okay.
So you can't compare to yourself.
What you're saying is
if you go around to like Windows users, like 85% of them are going to be complaining about viruses and the issues, the antivirus software that they have to pay.
Here's another thing too. McAfee is a virus. Avast is a virus. Norton is a virus. All of those things that come bottled back. That's the other thing I do hate about like Windows and like PC bloat. I will admit to that. Yes. That being said, is there more like viruses? I think it's just a question of access, like you're saying. I just don't think.
Yeah, I mean, the other part of it too is that it's really easy for Apple to address viruses for their computers because they have 10 hardware options with their software. So they just do another patch in their OS and it fixes all those. Whereas with Windows, you've got a million combinations of hardware and software combinations, and they can't just create a simple patch that they can't just go test their 10 computers. They've got to test a million computers to try to figure out how to deal with this virus.
Right.
So
that being said, a lot of those problems are simply, solved by not going to questionable websites.
It's true.
Simple things like not being a frickin' idiot. Anyways,
it's true, and that's the idiot factor is the one that you're.
Right. No. And for the record, no. For the record, when people are less computer savvy and less technical, I generally point them towards Mac. I know I always get people hate me because I'm the Mac hater, but the reality is a little bit of education with your system on Windows goes a long way, and it's not that crazy. Like, people try to make it like Windows is this crazy illogical system, and it's not.
Software and how different digital audio workstations work within Mac versus Windows, which one's better for Mac or Windows, or which one's the best DAW. We already talked about that at the beginning. The answer is all of them are the best.
Mm-hmm. And some are better built for Mac, others are better built for Windows. And some hardware solutions are, again, designed for a Mac environment, others are designed for a Windows environment. And some are actually, I think Ableton's probably the most system agnostic, where it runs probably the most stable on both Mac and Windows.
Yeah, that's true.
Of all of the DAWs I've seen.
Yeah, because most of them they started on one. Like
Cubase.
Yeah, the software was built on one operating system. And then for demand to meet the demand of their customers, they ported it over to the other operating system. And so it's usually the one that they did it on first. Every once in a while, and I don't know of any DAWs that this is the case in, but every once in a while it happens in software where when they port it over to the other operating system, they have to rebuild it, and it ends up better than the original one.
Except for Pro Tools, because it's just built on the same crappy. I'm sorry, I get a little bitter about that.
Well, and that's why Pro
out.
Tools is going to be the last one to do the M1, the ARM, the Apple Silicon, because they're working on it,
Silicon.
Right? They should be.
I thought they already had M1 support.
Oh,
I thought they did too.
Native support? They had the Rosetta, but
yeah, there's the Rosetta. I thought there was native support already, but maybe there's not.
Yeah,
I think it is.
Maybe we look it up right now. But
I think the thing with Pro Tools though is that it wasn't originally designed to be a native digital audio workstation.
Yeah.
It was originally designed as a whole ecosystem where it's just the software is actually running on DSP
chips. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's what I mean, especially when I first started using Pro Tools LE, it was really rough because it was designed, it was Pro Tools TDM then, which was the DSP powered system. And it was like porting it over. I guess we have to build this so that it works on the native system. And so it was really clunky for those first few years.
So I just want to make one key, because I don't know how many people know this. What we're talking about is Pro Tools originally had a slot that you could, like a PCI slot is what it's called, that you would put into your computer, and that has extra CPUs, extra processors on it that Pro Tools would then use. This is why a lot of people stuck with their G5 Mac towers for a long time, because they could just slot in a bunch of those cool HD Pro Tools cards and run it that way. So that's with Pro Tools LE, right? Or whatever. I can't remember.
Well, Pro Tools LE is the native.
Yeah, it's pre-Pro Tools 12.
Right. So Pro Tools native uses the CPU in your computer to do all of the processing for audio and plugins, which didn't really come into its own until we got more powerful CPUs. It was still kind of, like you were saying, clunky in those first iterations.
Yeah.
They weren't sure how to use them. We didn't have as much power. There's a whole bunch of problems that kind of existed. I think it was like around 2000 is when we first started getting more into that.
Well, yeah, because I mean, when Pro Tools came out in the late 90s, there's no way a computer could, like, you know, it could barely process like stereo audio, you know.
I still remember when I got a 128 megabyte flash drive. It's like, wow, I'm never going to fill this up.
Yeah.
I remember when I got my 160 gigabyte iPod, and I was like, wow, that's so much space. Oh, man.
I remember paying $50 for a 512 megabyte hard drive.
I remember that too.
Yeah.
I mean, I also remember 3 1/4 and like all the other smaller floppy drives and all that other stuff. So I'm a weirdo.
Yeah.
I remember flash drives.
But anyway, so in the 90s, that was the solution. The computer wasn't powerful enough. And so they had to put those digital signal processing chips, or the mini processors, for it to use it. And then it was in the early 2000s when, like, it was actually 2001, I think, is when I got my first Pro Tools system. Pro Tools LE5. And, yep.
Wow.
And it was like using the native processing, and the computers were just starting to get powerful enough that you could do stuff. And I mean, I don't know if I could do more than like 20 tracks before, you know, that had limitations. I couldn't put more than like 2 reverb plugins entirely. I think 1 reverb plugin. But there was those limitations. And so the DSP chips is what was Pro Tools TDM, Pro Tools HD, Pro Tools HDX, which they still have.
Yeah.
The HDX, and those really powerful systems have these dedicated digital signal processing chips on them.
Right.
But like Joe said, it's the native, especially in the last 10 years, the native's gotten powerful enough that people are like, hey, why do you need to spend all this money on these DSP powered systems when you can just have a really powerful native system? And
because computers have come a long way. And again, like those M1s and M2 Max, oh boy. I know I'm a Windows guy, but like the processing power is pretty rad, not gonna lie.
Pretty rad. He just said rad.
But even still with those though, you know, some companies have developed some hybrid systems for like Pro Tools. Well, Avid has their hybrid system, and then there's the UAD stuff that's DSP powered. But kind of like the biggest advantage with one of those DSP powered systems is the low latency with intense plugins. Like try running Auto-Tune on a native system on just your normal desktop.
Yeah.
You're not gonna be able to track live with that.
Yeah, and latency is the biggest thing. I mean, especially with the old TDM systems, like that was the only way to record with low latency and have it be professional level, was to have a Pro Tools TDM system. With the, you know, even when I was first recording with Pro Tools 5 and my Digi 001,
nice.
The latency, you had to do low latency monitoring, and it would like try to run it as low of latency as possible, and it was still problematic. Whereas with the DSP, the dedicated system, the dedicated DSP, you can record with low latency. And that's what, like my system, like we've talked about before, it is also a DSP kind of powered system. And the main thing I use it for is to record. Like I use the mixer that is for the hardware to run all my like recording through, so I can have as low latency as possible, and it works really well. So
I want to make one more point, because we do need to move on to like hardware, but specifically like audio hardware, like things like interfaces and upgrading. But I want to make a point about different processing chips and different versions of Daws. So it is important for you guys to understand that certain Daws, Pro Tools especially, are designed for certain types of computer systems. you might not understand this, but in the computer world, they kind of break down computer systems into different like categories and marketing categories. So most of your Mac laptops and most of your Mac your like cut down more like home friendly Macs, like the ones where it's like the computer's all built into the monitor. Those are more like family friendly and family oriented. They don't have as much power under the hood as things like the M1 Studio or even the Mac Pro and like all of those other things in the Mac Pro Tower. And those kind of, the Mac Pro Tower, the M1 Studio, those kinds of things in Mac are more workstation focused. And so what I'm getting at here is Pro Tools is more of a workstation designed DAW. Not all of them are. And one of the things that I think is super important to realize is things like Ableton Live, Reaper, I think even Reason, Studio One, and some of the more like updated, more digital in the box DAWs are kind of better at using modern CPU features versus Pro Tools, which was designed with a workstation. There's a little bit more nuance to that, but that's another thing to realize is some are designed, and here's another thing, some are designed better and run better on Intel, some are better on AMD for you Windows users out there. And again, some Mac systems are still being upgraded, like some DAWs, I think Pro Tools is finally M1 good, like good on the M1 and M2 and stuff like that.
Did you guys look it up? Did it say it was?
I think so. It looked like, here, I'm gonna double check really quick, but like things like Pro Tools M1 native support are like more common today. Yeah, it's good on M1 now. Monterey and M1 2022.3, which isn't that a couple versions older? I can't remember.
That would have been March 2022.3 is March.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's cool.
But it runs on M1.
But yeah, like and that's the thing. There's a whole history about that too. Like Mac used to be on these Motorola chips, and then they went Intel, and so all of a sudden the crossover between software that would work on Windows computers and Mac computers became a lot more flexible because it was a similar architecture with Intel. And then now Mac is going to this M1 ARM processor. It's also called Apple Silicon.
Which is awesome. I don't care for the Apple Silicon label, but M1 and M2 are actually like super awesome.
Yeah.
In a lot of cool ways.
And it's this whole concept of trying to incorporate all the, a lot of separate components that are happening in the computer, like hooking them all together.
And making it closer and faster. Yeah. That's why M1's super cool. They, instead of like a lot of things on like Windows computers, and they still struggle with this because they're trying to appeal to a wider audience, like Windows, and I would say like the difference between desktop and like workstation systems is greater, but things are put in like one thing is here, one thing is here, one thing is here. And now it has to travel across your board to get to the processor to get that information, which you're thinking, oh, that's not a big deal, except when you're doing billions and trillions of calculations per picosecond or whatever. It's not that crazy, but per second or whatever. Apple said, why have these over here? Why not just shunk? Because nowadays we can actually deal with the heat a lot better because of like thermal architectures and like better designs for those computers. And so Apple's like, why not? We have our own silicon. We're not confined by like Intel's chip design quality. So we can shrink everything down and put it closer so that now we can have quicker and faster latency movement between the different sections of processing, which is rad. Awesome.
That's also one of the differences about the Apple Silicon, though, is that it's not just a CPU. It's a CPU and a GPU.
Yes.
And RAM all together.
I mean, Intel's been doing CPUs and GPUs for years, but they're not really GPUs in the same sense.
Yeah, and it all came from like the handheld devices. They developed this ARM type processors for the handheld devices, and then they actually, the funny thing with Apple, they realized that their iPad Pro was actually running more efficiently than their laptop. And so that's when they decided they're like, whoa, our processor for our iPad is better than our Intel processor. So let's talk about the hardware. We talked about the software with the different DAWs, and really the hardware part of that is that, as well as like some companies have software that works better on Windows or works better on Mac, it works the same way with hardware too. So there are some interfaces, audio interfaces, and other audio hardware that, like certain companies, they work better on Windows and dude.
Well, I was going to say, like, Bryant, you've had some issues, not issues, but issues with customers that have purchased equipment and trying to get it set up on Windows versus Mac. Like, talk about that.
There's been quite a few people that have, and these are like beginner people, just average Joe. They've never done any sort of recording before, and they want something. Kind of the expectation with anything today is that it's going to be plug and play, and within audio, especially, that's not always how audio is. It's not always plug and play. You have to do some troubleshooting,
especially on Windows.
Yeah, especially on Windows, and getting your audio interface to work on Windows. But part of it comes down to how familiar somebody is with computers, how kind of like tech savvy and computer literate they are. Like there's certain people that I wouldn't even. It's like, oh, you want to get into recording? Well, let's get you this handheld recorder.
Here's a Zoom.
That'll be the best thing for you.
There's a technical prerequisite aspect. You have to be a little bit tech savvy. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah. If you can get a printer to work with your computer, you can probably get an audio interface to work with your computer.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'd say it's about the same difficulty.
If you don't feel competent to get a printer to work, then you're probably not going to be competent to get an audio interface to work.
With that being said, I do want to bring up like certain ones that are like better designed for certain systems. So I use RME. That's my interface that I use because it's better integrated into Windows. And it does a lot of things that Windows really should do that Core Audio does on Mac. But now I get a lot of other features too with my RME stuff. And I highly recommend, it's RME and Steinberg?
Yeah, so
are the two?
RME and Steinberg, yeah they're the two companies that are really more Windows oriented. And really, if you go into a professional recording studio that has a Windows based system, they'll most likely have RME. There's a couple other interface companies that they will, but RME is, especially for having a bigger, fancier system, RME is really
good
powerful.
clocking.
Yeah, it's
very
really
powerful. They don't have any DSP, which is kind of like, I think for some people is like a major like turnoff, because like UA, which is more Mac centric, and Apogee are more Mac centric. You get a lot more things like that with like DSP with UA.
Well, kind of the cool thing though with RME though is, and it's also, some people have complained about it. RME is still operating on USB 2. And there's actually a really nerdy video on YouTube that you can watch about why they're only operating on USB 2. And it's actually really fascinating. I definitely check it. I definitely recommend doing a little YouTube search there and finding that. But it's kind of cool because really you don't need any speeds faster than USB 2 for audio. And RME's done a really good job at optimizing their software to have extremely low latency, like virtually zero latency with their software.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've never had any issues like that. I mean, I only have a baby face, but whatever. Babyface Pro, whatever.
Just a little baby face, Joe.
I love it, dude.
It's a great interface.
It's a great
Sounds
interface.
amazing.
And then on the Mac side, if I ever talk to somebody and they're like, hey, I want to get my first audio interface, but I want to get something nice. If they're on Mac, I'll get them an Apollo, like an Apollo Twin. If they're on Windows, I'm not going to suggest an Apollo, because even though Apollo is supported on Windows, UA doesn't even support their own software, Luna, their digital audio workstation, on Windows. And everything that comes to Windows comes very, very slow from UA. And I don't think it's a very good supportive system. So I'd suggest the Babyface over that.
Likewise, with those kinds of considerations, it's important to realize that though something can run on maybe both systems, it might just be more like, there are things like this. I ran into this a lot with Pro Tools. A lot of people on Pro Tools tend to come from a Mac environment. And sometimes the issues that you run into on Windows, no one's encountered because you're the only one. And I've had a lot of instances where I'm searching through forums, I'm searching through other helps, because I fix my own problems. I can't find answers because I'm like the one person. I'm like one of 100 people that use Pro Tools on Windows. It's not really that small, but you know what I mean. I'm very and so there are things like that can mess with your user experience on those systems, on your operating system. I mean, I don't have Pro Tools crash that often, so it's not that big of a deal. Anyways, just realize that things like that can happen, even though it's supported on your system, quote unquote.
Yeah. And it's important, and that leads to another thing. I know at the beginning we talked about what's the best and neither, some of the points that the reasons why you would choose one over the other are these things. Like which piece of hardware do you have already, maybe? What's your experience? Are you really comfortable with Windows, or you're already really comfortable with Mac? What are your friends using? What software are they using? If your friends are all using Cubase, all the bandmates are using Cubase, then maybe you should use Cubase. And because Cubase is made by Steinberg, it is way better on it's really great on Windows. So those are all those kind of things. Those are the real questions to ask yourself. Which should I use?
Something else that's important to think along those lines is, what kind of music am I wanting to produce, or what exactly am I wanting to do with audio? If I'm just doing a podcast, I probably wouldn't get any of the major DAWs. If I was doing a podcast, I'd probably just get like Adobe Audition. But if I'm doing electronic music, Ableton, if you look at the people that are using, Ableton within the electronic community, it's pretty huge toss up between Ableton and FL Studio. Yes. And so those are really good for like electronic music. If you're mainly wanting to like record audio at the same time, any of them are really good, but like Pro Tools specifically, in my opinion, is like really, really good with audio. Yeah. Some people don't like Pro Tools because they don't like its MIDI capabilities, and they like Cubase and Logic for those reasons, or Digital Performer.
Mm-hmm. Also, I want to make a note, because I think, Bryant, you hit on a lot of good things, and I want to like a little bit more of a refinement to what you said, that a lot of people will use these things. Like, I have a friend that loves Ableton, and he's great with it, and he records in it, and he does really good mixes from recording in Ableton. But when I ask him about some of those things, it takes more steps to make the same things happen, whereas Pro Tools, it's like a keystroke. Or on another. So when we're talking about it's quicker or it's more designed for that, we're talking about how quickly you can get to your end results in that DAW. All of them can pretty much do the same thing. The question is, how many steps does it take to get to that end result? Yeah. And that's why the different workstation flows are different.
A good example is even today. So my assistant, Jacob, who's going to edit this podcast, we recorded drums. Thanks, and he uses Cubase.
You're Jake.
And so we recorded the drums, and he was taking Cubase. He was taking the tracks home to edit because it's for his project. And I'm like, you really should just edit them here in Pro Tools. And so he came back today, and he's like, yeah, the multi-track editing features in Cubase they're kind of difficult. And I was telling him, I'm like, I ran into the same thing with Logic. Like, I was working with somebody and we'd recorded drums in Logic. That was what they were using. And so I was like, let's do it in Logic. And then I was trying to edit the drums, and I was like, and I kept running into problems, and it throws them off. And I was like, that's it. I'm just exporting to Pro Tools. I took them to Pro Tools. It was super easy to edit, and then I moved them back to Logic afterwards because I was like, and it took me like a tenth of the time. And part of it's because I'm really comfortable with Pro Tools, but part of it too is that Pro Tools is really designed to be like a recording studio where you're recording live instruments and stuff. And so, whereas those other ones, you can do single track editing, but they're like multi-track editing. We'll make it work, sort of, but they all have it's true, like they're designed for different features and different user bases.
And how quick to get to those. I want to, let's move on to the next topic. We have two more left. We have upgrading and then finally cost. I feel like both of those kind of need to be covered at the same time, because upgrading is a part of your cost. So here's the thing. With Mac, get the fastest thing you can, because getting those things upgraded can be expensive. Is it good? Yes. A lot of that processing and a lot of the power is great on Macs, and a lot of them come out of the box with a lot more power than you're going to find on, cheaper Windows computers. I will say this. For the vast majority of what you're using, if you spend the same amount on Mac, you're going to get the same power on Windows if you spend that same amount. You're going to get pretty much the same features, but here's the catch. You're going to have to do your research. You can't just drop $2,000 on a laptop, because there are people who are trying to, screw you out of things, and they might not be concerned about certain things that other people are. And so you have to realize with Windows, you get what you pay for, but you got to do your research. With Mac, you get what you pay for.
Yeah.
And it kind of simplifies it on the end.
Which that's a good point. I want to add to, it's like you look at it and you see the Macs that are available. It's a $2,000 laptop. And you're like, but I can buy a $500 Windows laptop. And why isn't there any $500, Mac laptop? It's because the Mac's offerings at the time are like they're doing the most powerful ones that they can do. And so that $500 Windows laptop doesn't compare to that $2,000 Mac laptop. And just like Joe said, if you buy a $2,000 Windows laptop, it does compare to that $2,000 Mac laptop.
But you got to do your research because there are like bad sales tactics on that size because you have a lot more different companies that are manufacturing things. There's a bigger market. You're going to have to do your research. Kind of like if you're buying a car, you got to do your research.
Yeah.
And then upgrading your hardware on a Mac just doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, like the interesting thing.
What about the studio, the new tower? Come on, that's like upgradable, isn't it?
Yeah, the Mac Pro.
Yeah, the Mac Pro.
Yeah,
so you want to spend $6,000.
It's funny because I've been having this debate for 20 years, and when I started having this debate 20 years ago, most of the stuff that a regular human being would upgrade on their computer was equally upgradable on Mac or a Windows computer. And yet it was still like, oh, you can't upgrade Mac, since like you can upgrade the hard drive, you can upgrade the RAM. Those are the two most common things to upgrade that regular people, and Joe is not it's the gamers. That's always Joe's an extraordinary person. He's not a regular person, right? And so,
are any of us regular people?
No,
not at this point. That's a lie. It's like,
but like then you're gonna want to upgrade more than that, like the motherboard and the processor and all these things, which the average Joe isn't gonna want to upgrade. But the funny thing is, over the past 20 years, Mac has made it less and less simple, if not impossible, to upgrade your hard drive space and your RAM. And so even now, it's like you pretty much have to order your computer with the amount of hard drive space and RAM that you're going to want permanently, because it's virtually impossible to upgrade those. Where
they're getting a little bit better.
Yeah,
Apple has been getting a little bit better, I think, in recent times because they've gotten a lot of backlash towards, and I'll tell you why. It's because of right to repair. There's a lot of backlash on the repair side of things from even qualified professionals who do this as their day job, where Mac will withhold things like schematics and other information from these qualified repairmen who work specifically on computers and specifically on Mac stuff. And they constantly are like, Mac, just give us this information and qualify us so that we can repair these for other people instead of having to go through your ecosystem. And Mac's like, no. Apple's like, no. Only we know how to manage our systems. And there can be problems with that with newer systems and other things as you upgrade. I want to get one more thing into this. So when you're considering that cost and you're considering that upgrade, you want to buy as big as you can on Mac. On Windows, you don't have to necessarily do that, especially if you have a desktop. Laptops are still kind of similar to what Mac is. You get the fastest CPU you can, but you can usually upgrade your RAM or your hard drives. With desktops, sky's the limit, dude. If you know what you're doing, you can get a lot of power out of it. Like I was saying earlier before the show, I was arguing that I spent $500 and I went from a 4-core to an 8-core CPU and it only cost me $500 versus potentially sending it off to a special repair technician for your Mac Studio or your Mac system and then having to spend that money and then those kinds of things and then having to ship your computer off versus me. I order that stuff in. I can be done setting up my computer in about 2 hours depending on the setup and the change. So the great thing about Macs is that you get a lot of power underneath and you don't have to worry about upgrading it in a lot of ways. But as computers get older, they lose a lot of power and other things like that, and you need to upgrade things to kind of maintain that. But the good thing is that you're going to get a lot of power and it's going to have a lot longer lifespan than maybe a Windows computer where you're going to be updating and refreshing fairly quickly. But it's a lot easier on a desktop to upgrade and refresh your computer consistently. So again, cost, you get what you pay for and you get what you research. And it's the same thing with audio equipment. You don't just go buy whatever, And it's the same thing with computers. The question is, do you want to spend that extra time on your computer as well as your equipment? Not everybody does.
part of it too. I think a big point of this is that there is a technical aspect. I mean, that's why recording is a technical field. I mean, it's artistic as well, but it's technical, and there's computer technical skills that are needed for it. And there's skills that supersede the IT guys. It's funny because I've had lots of times where IT guys are like, "How do you get Pro Tools to install?" You know, and I'm like, so I had this guy who was like a very experienced IT guy, years and years, and he was calling me up. And I'm like, oh yeah, you got to go to ilock.com and set up this account. And there's all these finicky things like for authorization and stuff. And they're always coming up with new aspects of it. But then just getting the right drivers and the right, everything in place, it just can be finicky. And I've had, like I said, I've had multiple times where IT guys are like, oh yeah, I can install this. And I'm like, whatever. And then I have to come in and save the day because I'm like, yeah, that works for regular software, but this is not regular software. It's its own. And I imagine that the video world's kind of the same way too. It's like, it's a little finicky and not just like regular software.
And even regular hardware. They have to get special monitors for video and stuff.
Yeah. And the hardware considerations is another aspect too. I mean, if you think about like, most software out there, there's like very little hardware components, but like for audio, that is a huge part of it. It's not like you just have your software that's doing everything for you. The main point of the software is integrating with the hardware. It's not like your image program has to work really well with your printer. Your image program can work fine without your printer. It doesn't need it. But your audio program has to work with your audio interface. Yep. So there's a lot of integration things, and it does take some technical knowledge, which is why there's all these great YouTube channels and resources online to help people out to figure those things out. But when it comes down to it, the decision, like we were saying before, like there are some good questions, like what DAW are you using? What hardware are you using? What are you comfortable with? Have you always used Windows? Have you always used Mac? What are you comfortable with, going around with? And then what are your people that you are working with, what you're collaborating with? What are they comfortable? What are they using? But when it comes down to it, like the cost that thing is, I've seen that over and over again where people compare the $500 Windows laptop to the $2,000 Mac laptop in this.
You're an idiot if you think a $500 laptop is going to easily compare against a thing like 4 times the cost.
Well, period. And they're not just. It's like, oh, the Mac's so expensive, and but then go get equivalent Windows computer, and it's the same price. So it's just like you're buying basically the same things, So, Bryant, do you have any?
I
closing arguments?
Don't have any closing arguments. Go Mac or go back.
Nope, go Windows, because Mac is for a bunch of like people who want Big Brother to be peeking into all their emails and knowing everything. No, they're not going to sell it to the government. No, they want that information for themselves so they can sell it to other companies. Nothing's safe. Anyways, I'm kidding. Guys, you have a great week. I think we fought it out really good this week. The Mac guys really gave me a run for my money, but we all know the truth. Go Windows. It's a waste of time to go with those Mac nerds.
And as always, mix good.
Then you messed it up.
Mix good.